Is your country going to starve or prosper? That's what's at stake with economics. Economics is the study of how to allocate resources in a world in which not everyone gets what they want. With a problem so important and open, it's easy to see that there'd end up being lots of different economic positions across history in the modern world, whether left, right, center, or off the chart. In this video, we're going to analyze the track record for how different sides of the political spectrum have managed the economy. We're going to see the three main economic philosophies of the modern world and what each of their strengths and weaknesses have been. Strap on for a controversial and exciting journey. Right now, if you were to look up a news story at the economy, you're likely to get a very specific narrative depending on the news outlet you read. As politics becomes more polarized, this gets worse. Ground News provides a way to look at all sides of an issue by providing access to over 50,000 diverse news outlets from across the political spectrum, so you can piece together and get the whole story. They even have a feed that shows you stories that aren't part of the mainstream, so you really get the full picture in a single app. See every side of the news by going to ground.news/whatif or click the link in the description below. Before we start, I want to address a couple things, the first of which is political bias. People are going to say before I start this video that I'm biased since I have a political position. I'm politically center-right, but this video isn't meant to be a right-wing rant. I try to be as objective with facts here as possible, looking at them through a purely utilitarian perspective of what has and hasn't worked across history. I'm going to point out the strengths and weaknesses inherent in each position. I will praise left-wing economics at parts of this video and condemn the right at others. There are other people who act as if having any political judgment is bias. However, we live in a world of real-world solutions and failures. Looking backwards, we can generally agree that every era of history has done things that were just dumb or cruel, like Spanish mercantilism or the Roman slave economy. Like every other era of history, we have stuff like that we're doing right now, and I'm going to try to use evidence to show you what I think they are. Also, this is not a strict right-left binary, since I don't think that's a very useful prism to look at, since under a lot of circumstances, we see the right and the left have the same economic policies, or the same side of the political spectrum of different politics. Tony Blair's Labour government in the early 2000s had more right-wing economic positions than the Tory conservative parties in the 1950s, for example. This is since the real economic breakdown isn't so much right or left. Across modern history, we've seen three different economic philosophies, and realistically, most countries are a combination of any one of these three. The first of which is liberal, or belief that the government should intervene in the economy as little as possible. The second is socialist, or that government should control the economy or be the economy, and the third is autarkic, or the economy should align with the nation's foreign policy. In briefer terms, an economy built around the capitalists, the government, and the foreign policy. I won't say any of these positions are for the people, since all of these positions claim that, and being for the people is impossible, since the people never make economic or regulatory decisions in a real sense, with the ruling class, whether democratically elected or dictatorially, doing so. The ugly truth is that the most common economic form is none of these, just corruption and random stealing, which is the rule of the day in much of the third world. Places like Argentina and the Congo can technically be operating under any one of these three economic philosophies, but realistically, for all of them, they'd be more dominated by the corruption and inefficiency that have plagued all their governments across history. The main point you need to understand here is that groups follow their incentive structures whether or not that's the intention that was put in place. Each of these positions creates incentive structures in society that are good for some things and bad for others. Each of these political positions do at least one thing well and one thing poorly, since any worldview has to leave things out in order to provide a comprehensive framework that makes sense. Let's look at each of these views. The first time liberalism as a conscious philosophy was articulated was in the 18th century in Britain and France under the physiocrats. They believed that the way to make a country wealthier was for the government to be involved in the economy as little as possible. This was at odds with the mercantilist view that was dominant, which was autarkic, and we'll talk about later. They believed that the government should try to manage the economy, and so there would always be as much physical gold in that country as possible. Afterwards, the English-speaking countries like the US and Britain embraced liberalism, to which it spread around the rest of the world to the point in which most countries in the world today are at least part of their economy being built off liberal foundations. A deep point to make here is that in America, the term liberal has been confused with left-winger, which is deeply ironic since the right's now more liberal in a traditional sense. Here we're going to use the term liberal to mean a person who thinks the government should have little influence over the economy and individuals as possible. Liberalism took surprisingly long to develop since it goes against the grain of history. Almost all of political history has been divided between too much order and too much chaos. Government was built to deal with the chaos of the world, whether invaders, barbarians, starvation, etc., and the governments that developed often became quite authoritarian and arbitrary, since in the choice between the chaos of the world and a stable tyranny, most people were willing to accept authoritarianism. If you look at most civilizations, you alternate between a stable, centralized empire that ushers in the golden age and eras of civil war, discord, and barbarian invasion. Look at how Westerners still idolize the Roman Empire while whitewashing its corruption, slavery, and countless civil wars. Intentions matter a lot to human beings, and so people like the idea of a powerful, centralized government looking out for them. The law always was beneath the ruler. The system that eventually got to liberalism over several centuries started in medieval Europe, where there was no strong political authority. The continent was divided between countless petty kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and church lands. This meant that in order to get any edge, medieval lords started to sign their political rights away to cities and merchants. The lack of political authority meant two things: the market and the law were gradually elevated above political authority in northwestern Europe. However, this was still an extremely illiberal system, and liberalism as a system only started to develop in northwestern Europe in the 18th century. The dominant tenet behind liberalism is belief that the law is superior to the judgment of social superiors. England was able to reach this stage since they literally had a civil war in which the side that believed the law was superior to the ruler won and installed an aristocratic democracy. All the strengths and weaknesses of liberalism come from this key point: belief in the law's superiority to the current ruler. The strength of liberalism is that it allows massive creations and wealth. The main thing that's held back the creation of wealth is not having enough stability that would make big investments worthwhile. People are willing to build massive factories, work longer hours, and the like if they know the investment will pay off, and liberalism, which involves very little government intervention in the economy, supplies that. Property rights, or that people know the law will protect their property, are the most important thing for economic growth. In the modern world, countries with good property rights become wealthy and those without don't. It's often that simple. The big problem liberals often fail to see is that property rights are dependent upon having an already stable society. A major point libertarians miss is that they often push to remove government power even when they really need the government to stabilize property rights. Look at Russia or Brazil, which have struggled with liberalism since their governments aren't stable or functioning enough to protect people's property fairly. Attempting liberal policies in these places is literally just giving money and power to the corrupt rich. Having no state doesn't get you to liberalism. It results in savage warlords enslaving their opponents. However, liberalism under fair conditions' ability to make money is tremendous. The results are often completely stunning. Look at India, China, and Eastern Europe, and much of Latin America, who experienced stunning economic growth over the last few decades once they switched to liberal economic policies. The world's major shifts to liberalism in both the 19th century and the end of the 20th have precipitated the eras of the fastest economic growth ever. I often get told I have a pro-capitalism bias, but literally when something works better than any other system all the time, you just have to come to the conclusion it's a better system. Politics is like hammers, I just try to buy the one that works. I often hear that liberal politics are heartless and inhumane, but consistently they've been extremely liberating. The thing that ended the power of feudalism in medieval Europe was the rise of capitalism. Ethnic minorities like the Jews or overseas Chinese were able to deal with constrictive and oppressive societies due to their skills at the market. Black people were successful in private industry far before they were accepted in non-profit organizations like government or universities. The introduction of liberal policies have resulted in billions of people being lifted out of poverty around the world. It always amused me that feminists often go off against capitalism, but women have gotten far more latitude in capitalist societies than non-capitalist ones, which are based upon patronage in the old boys club. Being sexist or racist lowers profit margins. If women are really being paid 76 cents for every dollar a man makes, I'm just going to hire more women since they're still good workers. People often seem to think capitalism is a racket by the rich, which is true in a lot of countries, but doesn't seem to make sense in developed Western ones. Look at how the most successful companies fluctuate decade by decade, with the richest companies often taking massive losses over short periods. Capitalists aren't artificially exploiting labor. The amount of money people make is literally the same as their productivity and the supply of labor. If you control for those, you get wages across history. Labor in the third world isn't exploited since they're paid less than wealthier countries, it's just that labor is inherently less productive, and so If those people weren't paid less than people in wealthier countries, they'd never have jobs in the first place. People also talk about how capitalism naturally ends in monopoly. This isn't true. Monopolies are normally outcompeted against unless they're already providing a service as efficiently as possible. This is since in a free market, a company that's charging overly high prices is just asking for a competitor to arise and undercut them. The only evidence we have of extortionate monopolies are those that have corruptly lobbied governments in order to control their field, which sadly happens a lot even in countries like America or the UK. These companies normally lobby under the guise of safety and protection, saying their competitors aren't doing things properly for the public's interests. However, with all its immense benefits, liberal economics does have a couple downsides that are systemically built in. The first is that although free markets do normally reset, it doesn't say anywhere it has to be a good reset. Human beings are a resource like any other. The Black Death or crises like the 30 Years' War were caused since the market was oversaturated with human lives and it was reaching equilibrium through millions of deaths. A major weakness of liberals is they ignore baseline stuff that you need. An example is welfare in schools. Let's say there's a mentally ill poor person. If they're living in Les Miserables poverty in a wealthy country with no welfare, their kids who could be living on the street will probably permanently end up in the underclass. You need to have the state force people to have schooling up to a certain age, since no parent should have the choice to forever keep their kids from functioning in society without letting those kids have a choice in the matter. Likewise, welfare allows people who have been down on their luck but are still productive members of society to permanently not fall into a poverty trap. Take investment in education, which is the best predictor of wealth both on a societal and individual level there is, but normally isn't factored into a market equation. Or infrastructure investment, a functioning military and police system, etc. Radical libertarians or crypto people often want to remove the government, which would be the worst thing to do here. Right-wingers and libertarians often don't focus on the effects of inequality at all, but realistically, inequality has deleterious effects on all of the things that produce a stable society that lets the market function well, whether social mobility, education, health, and all the fundamentals that let a market function effectively. The environment is the perfect capstone example of this. A pure liberal system only pays attention to profit. However, the environment is something we need to figure out for us to live in, as well as just being pleasant and beautiful. However, the market hasn't figured out how to cover the costs involved, so the environment's treated as if it has no value. This in turn could cause a climate catastrophe resulting in millions of deaths. The key problem of a purely liberal economic system is that it treats anything without a material value as worth zero, whether family, nation, environment, or free time. Liberalism's also extremely difficult to maintain in that it goes against human nature. People are inherently tribal and feeling-based and like the idea of the leaders of their tribe who are struggling to help them. The idea that a giant impersonal system that statistically helps people much more being in charge rather than one of them who's trying to help them is horrifying to many people. Whenever I hear critiques of capitalism, I hear, why isn't someone of my tribe, whether intellectuals, my ethnic group, in charge rather than this stupid system that keeps on telling me I'm not as important or worthwhile as I feel like I am? Well, time to move from a system that's been very effective and unpopular to one that's been continually popular but has a far worse track record. Socialist economic policies are those that give the government and bureaucrats more power. People talk about real communism, which has supposedly never been tried, to which my reply is, if Christians don't get to talk about the kingdom of heaven not being realized, why do communists get to treat real communism as a political option, given that both are fantasies that involve changing human nature? Left-wingers like to say they give the people more power, which is objectively not true, and that the market is on the whole controlled by the decisions of ordinary people, and socialists advocate giving government authorities more power. We've seen socialistic policies since the dawn of time. Ancient Egypt, Rome, China, or the Inca had economic policies pretty similar to that of modern left-wing governments. Whenever big governments have had the power, they've tried to exert it upon the economy, which is totally understandable since it's inside their self-interest. I've gotten shit for saying ancient Egypt was socialist, which is definitionally not true, since they didn't explicitly say they were part of socialist ideology. However, the way I read history is that I try to see how people act, and when two things tend to look or act the same, I just say they're the same. However, socialism as a modern ideology started with Karl Marx in the mid-19th century as a response to how painful industrialization was and the horrifying conditions of the poor, caused largely by overpopulation at the time. It started to become more influential at the turn of the 20th century, with capitalist governments choosing more socialist policies and one-third of the human race under communist governments, in which the government controlled the whole economy. At this point, we're going to split this movement between its extremes and center. For communism itself, there's no economic justification. Communism's killed 80 million people in a 60-year period, or more than every religion combined since the dawn of time. Communism's caused real-term declines in standard of living in every single country it was implemented in. When you see a split nation like Germany or Korea, the communist side always does worse. Whenever a nation stops being communist like China or Poland, it becomes wealthier. Communists point to stuff like healthcare in Cuba. However, they don't compare it to Chile, who had equal incomes when Cuba became communist and Chile became hard capitalist. Then Chile became far wealthier and so could afford things like healthcare and longer life expectancies, both of which they beat Cuba at now. However, once you look at countries with lower grade government programs or lowercase socialism, you find some of the most pleasant places to live in the world, like the Netherlands or Sweden. These are places with some of the highest standards of living in the world by a lot of metrics, whether happiness, lifespan, wealth, and the like. What's the distinction between Sweden and Venezuela? The key point to understand about socialist government intervention is that the only incentive governments really have is to stay in power. For politicians, they can be voted out of office, but for bureaucracies that normally are the ones who are actually making the decisions about how the economy should be run on the ground, they're not going to get fired even if they screw up. The degree to which the government works is dependent upon how cohesive the society is. Lots of countries have economic policies pretty similar to Scandinavia. Southern Europe and Latin America both have similarly left-wing socialistic welfare programs and taxes as Northern European countries. However, just like capitalism doesn't work in countries without stable rule of law, left-wing economic policies don't work in non-cohesive societies. I remember a Swedish friend once asked me why I didn't support Swedish-style taxes in my home city of Philadelphia, which is notoriously corrupt, to which my reply was, it would all get stolen. In corrupt societies, social programs become unwieldy and inefficient and don't work even if they have more funding. The difference is that Sweden or Japan are countries with low corruption, people rarely go on welfare if they don't need to, and people naturally work hard and don't cheat, since it's a culture where doing so will result in social ostracization. A great example of this sort of thing is that New Jersey equalized the amount of money their public school systems got between regions, and there was basically no educational effect since it didn't change the underlying communities, which were the decisive factor for school outcomes. The thing government is good at is holding businesses and people to standards. Businesses operate under the same incentive structures as anyone else, and so if no one's looking, can be extremely corrupt if it's inside their market interests. A good example of this is the East India Company, which hired cheap mercenaries in the 18th century to conquer India. This precipitated a tremendous amount of atrocities, since the mercenaries weren't accountable to human rights, which forced the British government to step in. The end of slavery in the US was big government stepping in on local rights. Although I am a right-winger, I think the US should have a public healthcare system, since I think it's better for society if we subsidize the poor's illnesses, since that can ruin people's lives and it's not their fault. Likewise, the government should support things that aren't economic for private businesses, or the results can be horrifying, like the military or roads. Socialists are right to see wealth as sometimes just luck, and so if you gave some things like education, health, safety, and the like to the whole population, the effects would be really good for all of society. Socialists go wrong when they try to overreach, which is realistically something they try to do a lot. This is since government bureaucrats are accountable to no one and normally just keep on trying to expand their influence. The biggest problem in socialist philosophy is that they think intentions really matter in politics. That if someone in power has goodwill and is trying to do good, they will. Starting with this line of thinking, they think that everyone that opposes them must be evil since they're not part of the good people who are trying to fix the world camp. Since socialists view themselves as the good people, they don't see their own limitations. An example of this going wrong is rent control. The intention behind rent control is that no one should have to pay insanely high rents, but the result in real terms is that no one's incentivized to build any new buildings since there aren't enough profits to justify it since the prices are artificially low. Rent control, whenever implemented, just makes housing more expensive, and when it's removed, housing prices have lowered the total price of rent. A major problem of intentional economic top-down decisions that big government entails is that it normally ends up benefiting the wealthy and powerful, since they're the ones who are already connected to the government and are in a position to do well. Government regulation benefits pre-existing businesses who have the money to adapt. Inflation hurts the poor the most. Eminent domain hurts the poor who don't have the political influence to deal with it. And whenever rationing takes place, organizations like banks or government-owned, it's always the friends of the government who get the rationed opera tickets or the loans. Socialists only look at distribution and not production. They tend to view capitalists as a social class they can just take money from. Look at raising prices, in which they think prices are just whatever capitalists say they are. Some socialists go as far as thinking capitalism and money are just some game we choose to play rather than immutable rules on how we deal with a world full of scarcity. This is why socialists have a tendency to inflate their currencies so much, since money's just a game that we can change, right? Or raise taxes without thinking that if, say, French industry has to compete with less taxed industries otherwhere, it'll be outcompeted or die. Alternatively, how American liberal cities raise taxes for spending only to cause businesses to leave, which means there's less money to spend. Socialists seem to view money as a fixed thing to divide rather than something that's produced and alive. A capstone and great example of the twin socialist tendencies of ignoring incentives to look at intentions and ignoring how things are produced is their support in bailing out of industries. Governments regulate monopolies and they want to be able to control industries by having a single player they can talk to. However, this ignores how if there was competition, that industry would be so much more efficient and richer for everyone involved. Bailing out things like airlines and other similar big government projects are done so as to not create too much pain in the short-term period. But don't look at how bailouts just incentivize those companies to be even more reckless in their spending and say no, they can be bailed out with taxpayer money. Something we need to cover is that socialist economies always result in stifling economic growth. And we see this even in wealthy and pleasant socialist countries where, if you look at Europe's percentage of global GDP, it's gone down since the 1960s from 38 to 24% of the world's economy, while the more laissez-faire United States has been able to maintain a quarter. And this has been the case for every single big government socialist economy in history. Autarky is the desire to be independent of the rest of the world's economy. I'm going to conflate it a bit with mercantilism, or the desire to have as much of the world's economy as possible under your nation's control, with the central point being carrying out the nation on the international stage as the most important part of the economy. Autarky is the natural state of economic governance across history, being the norm. Both sides of the political spectrum have used it, although it's generally associated with the nativist right more so now. Modern economics tends to dislike autarky and nativism. The party line is that nations shouldn't fear dependence on other countries for trade and resources. However, history has shown time and time again that countries which can't rely on themselves are starved in war. Across history as well, economic dependence has been a tool for political dependence. The European colonial powers would use their trade power to create formal colonies, and we see the Chinese spreading their economic influence to gain political power even today. This is something that I continually have to explain to Americans, since America is so geographically safe, being surrounded on both sides by massive oceans and with weak neighbors, that America's never felt the pressure or fear that other countries have of being subjugated. I remember talking to a Chinese friend about how depressing it must be to be a poor Chinese peasant only eating rice, and his reply was, "Rice is good. In the really bad times, you'd be eating tree bark." Also, America is one of the countries least dependent on foreign trade in the world, about 15% of its economy, so Americans don't even see, say, how much political influence they have on Canada or Mexico through their economic power. The great quest of Germany through the world wars, and especially the Nazi Party, was autarkic self-sufficiency, since Germany was a small country surrounded on all sides that starved during major wars. Hitler wanted to conquer Eastern Europe to provide the food, oil, and the like, so Germans wouldn't be influenced by foreign economic powers. Autarky is complicated in that it works well under some circumstances and not under others. Take protective tariffs. 19th century America had large tariffs to protect its developing industries from established ones in Europe. This turned out to be a really good idea, as America was able to develop a really powerful industry that it was able to conquer the world with in the 20th century. However, the counterpoint to this is places like Argentina and South Africa, which, due to their lack of competition with the outside world, tariffs meant that they had really inefficient industrial sectors. In America, internal competition was enough. It wasn't in these countries. Alternatively, until America opened itself up to foreign car competition in the 80s, American cars were terrible, but the foreign competition forced them to become better. Like socialism, a problem with tariffs is that they can often play to special interests inside society. For example, Germany's pre-World War I tariff subsidies for grain resulted in artificially propping up the Prussian nobility. You have to be very careful to have enough internal competition that you're not propping up something inefficient and bloated inside your country. Mercantilism, or the belief of trying to put as much through your nation's economy as possible, tends to have not been very successful. European countries, for example, tried to wire as much of their colonial economies through the mother nation as possible, which almost never worked in real terms and also resulted in corrupt colonial interests benefiting the most. The main key point is that you need to strike a balance where, on one side, you should be able to protect your country from being economically colonized by another with far higher economic abilities, and on the other, don't be like Japan or China, which fell centuries behind the West's technology by refusal to trade with them. I think the Chinese struck a really good balance here in recent decades, allowing foreign investments, but also forcing those companies to teach the Chinese to use that technology. You need to have the result of foreign investments or tariffs stimulating your economy, not killing or stagnating it. Culture is a really big component here. Some cultures interact with the world with strength and improve, and others are killed for reasons that are difficult to explain. It's hard to say why English influence crushed Ireland and put it in degrading poverty, while Scotland industrialized and became one of the richest places in the world. Alternatively, why Japan was able to deal with Western influence by adopting science and industrializing while China faced a century of humiliation. Immigration's a very similar situation. I hate when people give yays or nays on immigrants, like all immigrants come from similar cultures or economies and all need the same things at the same times. For a comparison, close to 80% of Laotian immigrants go on welfare upon arriving in America and 3% of Japanese do. I guess this is a good way to transition to the point of this video. Economics is complicated and I don't think there's a single prescribed way that works for every era of history and country. Liberalism, autarky, and government all have roles inside of them that are important for an economy. A major problem is that we view these political views as religions that demand loyalty rather than as tools that are useful for a society. Use liberalism to make money, use the government to watch to see if things are fair, and autarky to make sure your country stays independent. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Twitter or Instagram or my Patreon, where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my history of the world and cultural history of America. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.